Would you like to learn how to make a web shop in React? Great, then you are in luck today. What is about to start is a 25-minute quick start tutorial on how to make a web shop using React technology and 9 other technologies to make a web shop. Let's start with React. We assume you have the development environment installed already. That is, Node.js, Yarn, Visual Studio Code, and Firebase CLI. When you download the source code to this project, you will also get a PDF with installation instructions, step by step. A React project consists of an index.js file. In this file you usually find a render command and a reference to your app file. In our case you also find 2 additional tags, first the context provider which enables the React Context API, which we use to distribute state across components, to get global variables and global functions. And we have the tag browse router, which enables multiple URL entries to reach your app. The render goes to root and that tag we find in the index.html file also in a React project. This is how React injects its rendered content into this position in the index.html file. Pretty smart. Let's move along to the app.js file. Here you find many import statements. This is how React works. Each file is a component, and on top you place the import statements to the dependencies you want to enable for the component in hand. After the import statements you find a number of const-styled divs, and this is styled components to inject CSS into HTML. Inside of the styled component you find plain CSS. There is a spinner made in CSS. There is a styled component called spinner. It uses its CSS statement and props to either display the spinner or hide it. Let's move on to the JavaScript part of the component. You will find 2 global variables, the user, and the loading variables. The user variable we use to know if the user is logged in or not. The loading variable we use to set the spinner in a loading state, or in a non-loading state, spin or not spin. Usually we don't put a lot of code in the app.js file. In the JSX part of the component, after the return statement, we have our HTML and JSX statements. First we have a styled component tag called page, to inject some CSS. Then we have Modal's components, which we initiate always, then we use global variables to show or hide them. We only want to show one at a time. We have the styled component spinner. Then we have a styled component row1, and in that we have a React component reference to header. In the header component we have the top web page logos and menus. After that we have the row2, and here we have statements to set up our router. All paths listed here will be enabled. The products route is special since it has a :ID, so it takes a parameter in the URL, to be able to show different products depending on the value in the URL. The /orders route is also special, since it is a protected route. Only if the user variable is true or in a logged-in state, then the order page will show. On row 3 we have a reference to the component footer. That's it for the app.js. This is how React works. It has components. And the components have imports, a JavaScript function, and a return statement with HTML and JSX. JSX is the tags referencing other React components, styled components or other components. The JSX can also be statements like we had for the protected route to the orders page. So, there was a route to a shop component. This is the main component to show the content below the header and above the footer. The system with using styled components for row 1, row 2, and row 3 is my own design. I find it makes it easier to style the different parts of the HTML. This is a quick start to 10 different technologies, so I will speed up now. In the shop.js file you find exactly what you would expect. Some import statements enabling different tech we want to use. In our case, styled components, some React technologies, use effect to trigger code to run certain events, and use context to access global variables and global functions. We import filter and products, and those are other React components of our own design. We have pre-auth from our Firebase component. This is to interact with Firebase authentication API. And we have context from our own context provider file to access our global variables and functions. After the import statements we have some styled components, and then we have the JavaScript function of the component. In the JavaScript function we have some variables, a variable we get from the Firebase authentication API and 2 variables we get from our global variables. Then we have our use effect hook. The empty brackets will trigger the code to run only once. The code inside of the hook sets the spinner to not spin. In the JSX part of the component you see some styled component tags, and 2 React component tags, filter and products. The filter is the menu to the left where you select what type of shoes you want to display. The products component will show the shoes filtered in a horizontal wrapping list of product cards. Before continuing with the filter and products components, let's have a look at how global variables work. In the file context provider you will find all global variables listed as useState hooks. The useState hooks give us variables that live as long as the component lives. At the bottom of the component you find the global variables and functions listed in a variable, and that variable is then distributed to all consumer components through the React Context API. We have added 2 useEffect hooks to each variable to make them persist longer than the component. Why? When doing refresh in the browser you lose all state. We don't want that. So we have one useEffect hook triggered when a variable is updated, and when that happens the value is stored in Locale storage in the browser. And the second useEffect hook will trigger when a user hits the refresh, and the component run for the first time. In this case we read the Locale storage and put the value in the state so that it can be accessed as a global variable. Okay, this was a quick explanation of the global variables and functions we use in this app. Let's move on to the filter component. In here you find of course the import statements. You find styled components defined. You find the JavaScript part of the component. You see that we bring in some global variables and functions we want to use. You see the useEffect hook, and it is triggered when the chk1 variable changes. That is as soon as any part of the filter changes as a result of user interaction. As an effect the filter product's global JavaScript function will run, and the JavaScript will use the full product array and the filter settings to create a filtered array that the app will use to display the product cards only for the products that the user wants to see. Then we have the return statement followed by HTML and JSX. For the product styled component you see that it uses props and sends information to the styled component to control the color of the menu items. Which value to send to the styled component is controlled with a JSX expression which checks the chk1 variable. On this style div there is also a JavaScript command on click and that calls a function when the user clicks. Pay attention to the special syntax, the array function, you will just need to get used to that. Calling a function that has parameters will malfunction if you try it without the array function syntax. That's it for the filter.js. In the products.js, you find the import statements. In the JavaScript function you find a global variable getting its value with the help of the UseContext hook, and the context variable. Then you have the return statement with the HTML and JSX in it. There are JSX expressions, first a and statement that is only true if there are filtered products. And then the map statement that loops all items in the filtered products array. The product React component is called with props. The props hold information about the product. Let's have a look at the React component called product. It has import statements of course. It has styled components to inject CSS into the HTML. The CSS is either injected directly in the style div or with class selectors. By sticking to only using class selectors, I find my code is cleaner. In the JavaScript part of the component we have some global variables and functions. We have a local JavaScript function called goToProductPage. It uses a React router statement to navigate to the product page. It is one of those special routes with a parameter. In the script there are also statements to call global functions to hide a couple of modals that might be showing. For some reason I use prepared JSX here. I prepared JSX statements in a JavaScript function called makeList. I add HTML and JSX to an array called list. Then in the return statement I inject the list. Sometimes if you want to use a lot of JavaScript when creating your HTML and JSX, that is, if you have a lot of dynamically generated HTML, it might be difficult to handle this dynamic with JSX expressions only. Then I find it much easier to pre-create the JSX statements in JavaScript, in an array variable, and then inject it. Let's recap which technologies we have covered so far, okay? We have covered React, and that includes the useState hook, useEffect hook, UseContext hook, JSX expressions, and the structure of a React component. We have covered most of the JavaScript, and that is variables, some statements, JSX statements, with a map, and more. I feel we can cover more JavaScript before we end this Quickstart tutorial. So be patient. We have covered styled components. We have yet to cover the flexbox and position absolute, which are important. Be patient. We have used Firebase authentication, but we have not seen the call to the API, and we have not seen how we set up the authentication on the Firebase side of it. We will do that soon. We have used product data from Firestore, but we have not seen where the call is being made, and we have not seen how to set up Firebase Firestore. The actual steps of setting up Firebase authentication and Firestore is in the PDF file which comes with the source code download. See the description below. We have covered React Context API enough. We have covered React Router. I want to show you how to make a full text search. You have seen where I enable the modals in the app.js, but I also want to show you the interior of one of those modal components. Then we will be done. Let's hurry, we have only a couple of minutes to go. The flexbox is the most important CSS statement. With it you can make vertical filter menus, you can make horizontal menus, you can position logos with ease. You can make product cards, and easily place product description texts, prices, etc. It's invaluable. Let's have a look at the header.js file. In the styled component row 1, you see display flex and flex direction row. Divs are normally 100% of the width. But with the display flex you disable this behavior in a very quick way. Then the child components will line up in a row, that is R1 left section, R1 mid section, and R1 right section. I control the width with the CSS width statement. And with justify content and align items I align the content horizontally and vertically. These 4 statements I repeat over and over again, in all components, multiple times, to style the way I need. And styled components enable me to do this in a smooth way that does not clutter the HTML code. For the products.js file, you see I also use flex wrap equals wrap, and this is the 5th flexbox statement I use. Sometimes, as with the product card visualization of this shop, I will want to show a couple of products, and then wrap them to the next line. With CSS flexbox and styled components, styling a web page becomes easy. If you try using grid or float and global CSS sheets, styling a web app is a tough job, and the HTML and the CSS will become difficult to read and understand. Okay, that was the CSS flexbox. I will show you the call to Firebase authentication. Let's open the context provider. This is where I keep all my global functions. Also the calls to the Firebase authentication API. Search for sign in. Here you find the sign in with email and password, and that is a call to the Firebase authentication API. We call that with a JavaScript statement, and we use the response to either log the user in and set up the UI for that. Or we do not sign the user in and give an error message back to them. By studying this function, sign in, you will get an introduction to JavaScript. We have variables, we have logging to the console, we have calls to APIs, we have catch-to-catch errors, we have if statements, we have for loops, and that in itself is a quick start to JavaScript. I keep 95% of all my JavaScript functions in this context provider.js file, so you can study the other scripts to learn more. There is the sign out, all the calls to Firestore, all the calls to Firebase authentication, adding and removing products from the cart, and so on. Setting up the Firebase authentication on the Firebase side is covered in the installation PDF. But quickly I will show you. Just sign up with Firebase to get an account. Then create a project and answer a couple of questions. It does not matter which server they place your DB, choose the default. And you will not need Firebase Analytics for now. Then click Authentication, click Get Started and answer a couple of questions, and then choose the sign-in method email password. It's that easy. Setting up the Firebase Firestore database is easy. Sign up for a Firebase account. It's easier if you have a Gmail email address, so set one up. When in the Firebase console, click Firestore, click Get Started, answer some questions, and you are ready to go. To get this Quickstart app, Webshop, up and running, including database, we will need to add some products to the database. I have prepared a function for this, it's called add mock products. You will also need to copy the settings information from Firebase to your app. It's all in the PDF instruction, but let's do it. Click Project Overview, click Project Settings, find your apps, click Config, copy the settings text, switch to your React app, and paste the settings into the Firebase.js file. That's it. Now let's check the add mock data JavaScript function. Open the contextprovider.js. Search for AdMock. We found it. Search shortcut is CMD+F. Here you find some JavaScript randomizing names for products, image for products, price, etc. And then there is a call to add course, and this is where a product is added to the Firestore database. Let's have a look at that JavaScript. It's just a call set with the data as a parameter. It's very easy to interact with the Firebase API. You see me using both version 9 Firebase and pre-version 9 Firebase API calls. I have snippets of code saved on a disk, and depending on what I need in my coding, I might find a reuse which is version 9, or sometimes it's a reuse of the previous syntax. In this web shop I ended up using both. Have a look in the firebase.js file. You will see comments with FB9 or pre-FB9. You rarely find tutorials on YouTube using both. You will need to master both. Because when you find reference code from YouTube tutorials, they might be FB9 or pre-FB9. Also, you might want to integrate with some external React component which assumes you use pre-FB9. I find it very rewarding to have both versions set up in my firebase.js file, and then I can go either way and save time and be compatible with all external React components. Let's do a recap again. I believe I have covered 95% of what I aimed for. 2 more technologies I want to show you. React modals and full text search. Let's use the sign in modal. It's a normal React component. It has the import statements. It has the styled components. One of them is special. I called it modal. It has props as input parameters, show modal. Depending on if it is true or false, I will inject CSS. To inject we use the styled components technology called CSS, and this technology needs to be imported as well, see the top of the file. So, we either keep the modal hidden, or we show it. And we control that with a prop. Now let's look at the JavaScript part of this component. It has a useEffect hook triggered when the global variable show modal sign in changes. Then if the value is true, it sets the global variables for email and password to blank. We have a function called closeModal, and this is run when the user closes the modal. We will find an onClick statement in the HTML code later, pointing to this function. Let's scroll to the return statement. Here we have the styled components tagged to modal. It sets the prop with a value from a global variable show modal sign in. And this is how we can trigger the modal to show up, just by setting a global variable to true from any component in the app. Also have a look at the styled components, modal1 container, modal1, and background. They have position fixed, so they don't move when the web page is scrolled. The rest of this modal is like a normal React component, where I use row 1, row 2, and so on. And finally we have the full text search. Most websites want to have a search function. Firebase does not include technology for this. As you can see, I have full text search in my app. How did I get it there? Firebase recommends using an external provider. I tried that, but it got complex, and also it costs money, and also it included me moving a lot of data over to this provider for them to search in. Not what I wanted for a Quickstart tutorial to make a web shop. So I made my own full text search. I studied the external provider documentation, and I understood the basics of how a full text search works. Let's have a look at the modal search.js. We find import statements. We find a styled component called page which I use to show or hide the modal. In the JavaScript part of the component we find a couple of global variables and global functions we bring in with the help of the UseContext hook. We have a useEffect hook triggered by the search result list, when this variable changes. If there are items in the array variable, the search result bar should show. As a first step, a global variable is set to true. Later in the results section of the component, we find a styled component div that will show or hide depending on this variable. In the R1 left styled component tag we have an input tag. This is the search input. When it changes, on change, the search text variable updates, and the useEffect hook is triggered. And then the JavaScript is triggered, the script searching through the product array. If there is a hit, the product is added to the variable search array. When done looping, this array is placed in the search result list. And later on this search result list is injected to the HTML as part of the styled components tag result box. Okay, another recap. We have covered everything. I just saw an opportunity. I would like to show Portal. It's part of React. With the modals I use portal. You see that in the return statement. It is special. It says create portal. And at the end of the return statement you find the string portal. This JSX will be rendered to a place in the index.js file to a div with an id portal. Why use portal and not root? If we use a portal we make sure we have our modal in a separate event hierarchy, of its own. This way we avoid strange app behavior when a user clicks outside of the modal window. Is it not enough with setting the CSS statement z-index? No, it's not bulletproof. Set a high number of your z-index on your modal, and also use a portal in your return statement. That's it. This is my version of a quick start to learn React by using a web shop. Now download the source code and get it up and running. With the source code you get a PDF with installation instructions, step-by-step instructions on everything, including setting up Firebase authentication and Firestore. Then hold on to this source code. Let it be a vital part of your snippet archive for when you need to implement authentication in your app, or use Firestore as a database, or for the day you need to use React Router, or UseContext API. Oops! I forgot to show you the CSS position. It's also key to understanding the CSS you need to style this web shop. Open product.js in the components folder. The styled component product item has position equals relative. This is needed for the parent component of content you want to place with absolute positioning. Scroll down and find a class selector product image. It has position equals absolute. Now you can control the position of the product image independently of other contents in the product item component. This is the level of control you will want to design a product card and style it in a good way. You can use bottom, top, left, right, CSS statements to position your sub-elements. That was 100% all I wanted to say. You have completed the video part of this tutorial. To learn in a good way, we recommend you now download the source code. It will include installation instructions in PDF format. Then take the step-by-step instruction to set up the React project, Firebase, and everything. Then play around with the code. And keep it for future needs. Thank you once again. I really hope you find this to be a great quick start to learn React. In particularly to learn how to make a web shop, including Firebase authentication, Firestore database, styled components, CSS, and state management.